Hello and welcome to episode 17 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on October 27th, 2019. Today I'd like to talk to you about about part of my trip to Shetland Wool Week. I knew I wanted to do 2 episodes on Wool Week because it's just such a massive event that I don't think you could do it justice in one episode. But when I sat down and started planning out the first episode, I started with a chronological description of the event, and I realized that it wasn't working. It was just becoming a laundry list, and that's nothing like the reality of the event. So I settled on splitting the event by genre, I guess is how I would describe it. So in this episode, I'll talk about the experiences involved with Wool Week and being at Wool Week. And then next week, I'll focus on the classes. First of all, we arrived in the islands a week before Wool Week started. I wanted to spend some time on Yell and Unst because I hadn't made it to see them at all on my first trip. Unst is the farthest north of the two, so you might expect, like I did, that it would be the less populated and developed of the two, but Unst used to have an RAF base on it, so it's a bit more developed and has more tourist facilities and sites. But one thing to keep in mind with either island is that, as of this year anyway, several of the restaurants and smaller sites had closed their doors for the season starting at the beginning of September. This wasn't the end of the world for us because we were in an Airbnb and we could cook for ourselves, but it did limit some of our options for ways to spend our time. But we just spent more time relaxing, so I can't really complain about that. Both islands are incredible places to be out in nature. The locks and the coastline and the views are all spectacular. If I had to pick a favorite spot, I would be hard-pressed. I think there are 2 areas that are strong contenders, though. Both are on Unst, and they're actually quite close to one another. The first is Norwich Beach. It's an area where 2 continental plates are converging, and there's a large uplifted area between 2 beachy areas. One area was sort of traditional sandy beach, and the other side had lots of seaweed growth, but also had a few curious seals who came to watch us as we were scrambling about. It's also an area where I found a good handful of beach glass and beach pottery. The other area I really loved is actually the old RAF base. It's not far from Norwich Beach at all, but it's higher above sea level and drops off to cliffs on either side. We were there one day when the seas were relatively calm and the sea crashing against the cliffs below was sending sea foam up and over the cliff where we were parked. And a few days later, there were very strong winds, and we went back specifically to see the difference in that area. And the force of the wind coming up over the cliffs and the grinding of the waters beneath were a powerful reminder that the sea and the wind and the weather do not care about you or your feelings. It will rage and churn and blow, and you better check yourself because it does not care about your Instagram photo or your desire to feel poetic and broody. Step too close and you will lose. Humbling. It was humbling. Anyway, that first week, we took life easy. We did visit a few of the sites on the Northern Islands. Luckily, the Old Ha Museum and the Unst Heritage Center were both still open. The Old Ha was built in the late 1600s for a merchant and is now a museum with displays relating to the general history of the area and the fishing and knitting industries, as well as the geology and wildlife. When we were there, they had a large display of knitted items on the ground floor, as well as tatted rugs. Tatted rugs? I think I'm saying that right. Which look like latch hook rugs to Americans and our sort of visual craft vocabulary, but they're actually made by sewing loops of wool yarn onto a fabric backing and then cutting the loops. They're very thick and heavy when they're done, and they used to be the warm bed toppers for the area. The knitting display was amazing. So many lovely Fair Isle sweaters and lace shawls. When I first walked in, my eyes hit this pink shawl that had Anne spelled out in eyelets on the back. And I was like, yes, that will be mine. Because I am a child of the 80s, and children of the 80s like to have their names in big block letters on their clothing. But sadly, or maybe luckily for my current fashion needs, it was not for sale. It was just there on display. The Unst Heritage Center is not to be missed. If you make the trip all the way to Shetland and you have even a passing interest in lace knitting, go the extra hour and a half or so from Lerwick to visit the absolutely jaw-dropping collection of lace on display at the Unst Heritage Center. There are lovely examples of lace elsewhere on the islands, but the collection in Unst is something else. The women of Unst prided themselves on the fineness of their spinning, and the finished work on display is truly impressive. If we properly valued knitting as an art form, the pieces at the Heritage Center would be hanging in a gallery rather than a museum. The time on Unst and Yell gave me enough time to finish knitting all of the Wool Week hats. Some of you may remember that I set the goal to knit all 6 this year, and I didn't really leave myself a ton of time to do it in. But thanks to all the really welcomed quiet time on Unst and Yell, I was able to get them all done. The Boosta Beanie actually came off the needles on the plane ride over, and then the Crowdfunder hat was finished on Unst. And the Schwook hat was done being blocked on the morning Wool Week started, so just under the wire. And then I wore each hat, a Harriet's hat, and my friend Marilee's Sea Pink's hat during Wool Week. Would I recommend knitting all 6 and taking them along to wear at Wool Week? No. I think you should knit them all. Knit in the right order. They are a great way to get comfortable with knitting Fair Isle, building on your skills with each hat. But 6 woolen hats, which will become 7 next year, actually take up a massive amount of space in your suitcase. I think knitting all of them is a good idea, but just take the official hat for the year when you go. I'll talk more about that in a second, but before I get too far ahead, I'll share my theory of the order that I think you should knit the Wool Week hats and why. So first, I think you should go with the Boosta Beanie by Gudrun Johnson. The brim has a very simple to work color detail to start, and then it's just a basic rib. And the hat is an undulating wave of 2 colors on a solid background. It's a great first Fair Isle project because the pattern is simple enough that you can focus on tensioning your floats properly and not have to really worry about anything else. Then move on to the Schwook hat by Hazel Tyndall. Schwook will introduce you to traditional Fair Isle patterns, so it will require you to pay closer attention to the pattern, but you still don't ever have to worry about catching any floats. And the crown is a lovely 8-petal flower that looks much harder than it is. Just follow the pattern and you will astound yourself with your skills. Next, take on the Peerie Dancer's Tory, designed by Elizabeth Johnston. Again, the patterning on this hat is not difficult. They're mostly squares and crosses. You still won't need to worry about catching your floats at the back of your work, but the Peerie Dancer's Tory introduces a corrugated rib brim on the hat. With the corrugated rib, you're working a knit 2 purl 2 rib, but one or the other is worked in the accent colors. So the pearls may be the background color while the knits are in the accent colors, or vice versa. To be honest, I do not like knitting corrugated rib because it slows me down. I want to get to the main pattern as soon as possible. But I think they look lovely, and it's a way to see how all the colors of the pattern work together before you dive into the main pattern, so I have mixed feelings about them. They do seem to be very common in Fair Isle hats, so it's a technique you need to learn, but luckily they aren't tough, and with 2 hats worth of experience behind you, you should pick it up quickly. The thing to remember is that even though it's a knit 2 purl 2 rib, because you're changing colors between the knits and purls, it will not pull in on itself like a normal knit 2 purl 2 rib when you work it in one color. So don't think you're doing something terribly wrong if it lies more flat than other knit 2 purl 2 ribs you've done. After Peerie Dancers, move on to the Bauble Hat by Donna Smith. This is possibly the most knit of the Wool Week hats. I saw one on a teenage boy here in Connecticut a couple months ago, and every child in Shetland seems to have one, as well as many of the adults. You'd probably recognize it if you saw it. It's an Aran white hat with a ground color at the bottom, a row of black-faced sheep around the center, and then a starry or snowy sky above with a pom-pom on top. Why this one next? Well, first of all, it's a quick knit because it's Aran white, so it'll be a nice speedy project. But also with this hat, you will have areas where you will want to catch your floats at the back of the work when you're working the sheep. So hop over to YouTube and learn how to catch your floats without having to drop the yarn and twist it manually. You'll only have to do that in one area of the hat, so it's a good introduction to the technique. You can do it with thicker yarn so you can see what you're doing a little easier, and then you can finish off the hat and feel very accomplished. Next, I'd go on to the Croftus hat by Ella Gordon. You'll be putting everything you learned to work in this hat and be back to working in fingering weight as you do so. It has the corrugated rib, and you'll be catching floats on quite a few rows. But the pattern is a good one to use to practice reading your knitting because the main part of the hat is 3 rows of croft houses, just slightly staggered from one another. So you can work on looking at what you've done on the row below and remembering what you're meant to do on your current row. Which brings us to the most recent hat, the Roadside Beanie, which was designed by Oliver Henry and Sandra Manson. Again, this hat will draw in all the skills you've worked on so far, but the pattern is less intuitive. You'll need to pay attention as you shift from the sheep to the shoreline to the ships in the ocean. I have a few thoughts about the Roadside Beanie and the Wool Week hats, but since we're back to normal episodes, I have songs for you again. When I was on Shetland, music was everywhere. Many of the events had music, especially in the evenings, and music is just a big part of life there. You'd hear it coming out of pubs, and local music was on the radio and playing in the shops, and I was tempted to play some more music by Arthur Nicholson for you. You'll remember I played a few of his songs way back in the early episodes. He's a singer-songwriter based in Shetland, and I actually heard his songs several times while I was there, and I highly recommend him. You can find his music at arthurnicholson.co.uk. But I hopped over to the website where I usually get my music, and while I've been gone, they've changed their website for me. So I got sucked into playing around with the new site, and in the course of events, I found a couple of songs that reminded me of aspects of Shetland, a mood or a place on the island, and so you're going to hear those this time instead. The first song reminded me of the drive from Lerwick, where many of the classes I was in took place, to Scalloway, where the Airbnb was for Wool Week. We'd make the drive back in the late afternoon, and the sun wasn't down, but it was headed in that direction. Both towns are situated on their own bays, and as we crossed over the hill that stands between Lerwick and Scalloway, the light of the sun would hit the bay at just the right angle so that all the water in the bay just glowed a pale golden color as it reflected the sunlight. It was one of the most breathtaking things I have ever seen, to look down at this pool of fire that seemed to surround Scalloway. It was so bright that you could just barely make out the shape of these massive ships that were coming into the harbor. It was arresting. It was stunning. And now it sits in my memory, and I hope that you can see it too. This is Orange by Mark Robillard.
I'm gonna be alright, I've been caught in time. I want you to know that I love you so. My friend, the skies are bright, I see orange light. I want you to know that I love you so. And I feel like gold, and I love you so. I'm gonna be alright, I've been caught in time. I want you to know that I love you so. And I feel like gold, and I love you so. And I feel like gold, and I love you so.
One thing that I underestimated about the Wool Week hats was how important they were to the sense of community. Humans are social creatures. We need each other to be happy, and we conform. That might cause some of you to kick and squeal your disagreement, but it's true, we conform. It's very rare to come across a truly nonconformist person who doesn't have the backing and support of other similar nonconformists who are actually serving to validate their nonconformity by conforming to the same nonconformist ideas. And that's okay. By saying we conform, I'm not saying that we feel the need to agree with just one thing. Just that we tend to function better as individuals when we're part of a community that supports us in a handful of key ways. At the evening opening event for Wool Week, everyone who was there and had one was wearing their Roadside Beanie. I have to say that it was a little emotional standing there at the official kickoff in the sea of hats made and proudly worn by my fellow knitters. Some had branched out with their own yarn and color choices. Some had altered the pattern a bit to include Viking boats instead of the fishing boats, or knitting each sheep in a breed-specific yarn. But even with those little variations, people were there, participating in a communal act of knitting this hat that served as an identifier for the rest of the week. And it was an identifier. For the rest of the time we were there, Roadside Beanie wearing pedestrians gave each other smiles and nods, complimented each other on their color choices, or just knew who to ask for directions to certain venues and events. In the week before the event started, a Roadside Beanie was a signal that I could approach someone for a chat about how far they traveled and what classes they were most looking forward to. In the weeks after, spotting a Roadside Beanie meant I could bend someone's ear for a few minutes to reminisce about our shared experience in Shetland. And this community feeling carried into both the classes and the downtime of Wool Week. Someone would bring up something political and it would die on the vine. We weren't there to talk about politics. That could wait. The 1,000 attendees in their Roadside Beanie hats were there to talk about yarn and sheep and fiber and tension and patterns and refining their techniques and blocking and lace and fair isle and button making and bookbinding and thrumming and fleece. And sometimes we might dip into region-specific aspects of those topics by way of comparison, or maybe discuss what we saw as the difference between wool produced by Jamieson of Shetland and Jamieson and Smith, and which museum on the island had the best collection of knitwear, and maybe if they were generous, someone would share tips on the best restaurant in town and the quality of their Airbnb. But that was all. Wool Week is about wool. And it's about topics that overlap 90% with wool on the Venn diagram of discussion topics. And what happened as a result? Skills were strengthened, friendships were formed. People went home with photos and contact information of people they never would have encountered any other way. With no idea what their personal politics were, people bonded with one another. The focus of the week was on a shared interest, and people absolutely blossomed. And that hat, this year's Roadside Beanie, that was the sign. That was the flag saying to everyone else at Wool Week, I am here because we love the same thing. Let's talk. And there I was, rotating through all the hats I knit, and honestly, I regretted it. Now, I know all those hats are tied to Wool Week's past. They were part of the vocabulary of belonging, but they weren't the signal. Not everyone there was familiar with the Schwilk hat or the Busta Beanie. It wasn't quite the universal signifier that the Roadside Beanie was this year. So next year, I will knit the hat of the year, and I will take it with me and I will wear it on all the days. I will fully embrace the language of belonging and acceptance that reigned during that one wonderful week on Shetland. And I know that some of you are going to point out situations where this type of group signifier has been used for ill, that you'll cross your fingers before yourself to ward away any hint of conformity. But I would counter with the idea that just because a human need has been misused in the past doesn't mean that it can't be used for good. The Wool Week hat taps into our need to belong. It acts as an invitation to speak, to unite, to be part of a community in the best of ways. It is a uniform of unity. And if there's one thing that I long for now, home again in the United States, where the media would have me fear everyone, including my neighbor's dog, the thing I miss most about Wool Week is that sense of belonging, of acceptance, of interest. And I can't wait to see next year's design. Okay, everyone, this is the last time I'm going to talk about the Shetland Peri Mackers for a while because their crowdfunder is actually wrapping up shortly. If you have been meaning to make a donation and haven't gotten to it yet, this is your reminder to hop over to crowdfunder.co.uk/Shetland Peri Mackers and make your pledge. As I'm preparing this podcast, they're at 70% of their fundraising goal, and by the time this launches, they'll be under a week to get that remaining 30%. Shetland Peri Mackers is a volunteer-run group that goes into 20 different schools around Shetland and teaches the children to knit using the old methods. These kids are producing amazing knitwear at very young ages. Jamieson's of Shetland donates the wool they need, and the teachers donate their time, but there are other expenses that they incur along the way, and they need our support to keep the program going. They're trying to raise £10,000 and are offering some really amazing perks for people who donate at certain levels. So for a £15 donation, you will receive a pattern for mittens designed by Hazel Tyndall, the world's fastest knitter since 2004. And at £20, you'll receive 2 patterns designed by Jeanette Budge, a local Fair Isle teacher who was featured in my last episode. One hat reads Shetland Peri Mackers around the hat, but the other is a gorgeous, fiery Fair Isle pattern that would actually be well suited to a beginner, but would keep the interest of those with more experience too. At £30, you can receive a cotton project bag with local dialect words for knitting terms, and at £45, you can receive a headband knit in Shetland wool by one of the Peri Macker instructors. If there is a young person in your life who you'd like to start teaching Fair Isle to, a £70 donation will get you a child-sized knitting belt. There were quite a few donation options at the higher level that would get you a few nights stay here and there on the island, but right now the only option left is at the £300 level for a 2-night stay at Brentham House in Lerwick, which is perfect if you are planning a trip to Shetland in the coming year. And of course, any donation at any amount would be welcome. So again, hop over to crowdfunder.co.uk/Shetland Peri Mackers to make your donation and do your bit to help keep knitting strong on Shetland. There were some really lovely evening events during Wool Week. I enjoyed them immensely because they allowed time to meet some more people and have time to chat with them a bit. The first, of course, was the welcome night, which was the official kickoff to Wool Week, even though it technically happened on the evening of the second day. This was the first opportunity we had to be together as a large group, though attendance was still limited to something like 500 people, and I know there were people outside hoping to buy unused tickets. I do hope they were let in the end. There were a select group of vendors along the back of the hall, and people had time to mingle and start to get to know each other. I ended up speaking with a couple of women at this event who I then saw nearly every day for the rest of the week. The main stage event included all of the designers of the Wool Week hats who spoke about their designs. There was an interview with Oliver Henry, the Wool Week patron for this year. Oliver doesn't knit, but he was tasked with starting the first Wool Week event 10 years ago, and his career has been tightly connected with the wool industry on Shetland for decades. There was music, and it was just a truly jolly event. At the end, they took a group photo of everyone in their roadside beanies. The next night, we attended a lecture by Oliver Henry called A Journey with Shetland Wool and got to hear about his many experiences with grading fleeces and designing rugs and lines of yarn, and of course, Wool Week itself. You don't often get to hear someone stand up and outline what they are most proud of about their own career and life. I found it a very interesting experience, and I wondered if we all knew that when we hit, 70 or whatever, that we'd be expected to stand and give an accounting of what we're most proud of, whether we'd hold ourselves to a higher standard. Tuesday afternoon, we went on a tour of Chris Dyer's Croft House across the bay on Bressie. Chris and his family raise sheep and pigs and have a greenhouse and chickens, and it was brilliant to get to see how they manage everything. Crofters often have quote-unquote real jobs in addition to their croft work, so it limits how big they can get with everything, but it's a brilliant model for sustainable living, and it didn't hurt that we were there in the afternoon and the view of the sunset was simply stunning. We went home with some chops and had them for a few meals, and they were so delicious. It reminded me of the pork we could get in the Philippines that actually tasted like pork and not just generic flavorless meat. If you get a chance to go to Bressie and you're in an Airbnb or a self-catering situation, swing by and pick some up for a meal. Wednesday was the Woolie Thinking Quiz. And I'm quite partial to this event because it was my first experience with a pub-type quiz and my team won. So I'm still pretty proud of that. I don't take responsibility for the win. It was a good mix of players with different life experiences, and we filled each other's knowledge gaps pretty well. But this event was hosted by Hazel Tyndall and Jeanette Budge. There was a delicious buffet before the quiz, and then we got down to business. The quizmaster had come up with quite a few rounds of questions that were tangentially related to wool or Shetland. So, for instance, the first round was sports, and all of the sports teams had to do with sheep in some way. There was a round of Shetland wildlife and a really tricky one of riddles in the local dialect. In the last round, there was a question asking what Jeanette's connection was to Hazel, and I'd just done the interview with Jeanette a few days before, in which she'd mentioned that she was Hazel's first cousin once removed, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have inside information. But that's not what won it for us. We did really well on the riddle section, and that's when we pulled ahead and we were able to hold on to that lead for the rest of the night. Thursday night was the MRI Macker special event at the Lerwick Town Hall. It is an absolutely gorgeous space to hold an event. There are high ceilings and lovely wood walls, and all the windows are stained glass panels of the different people who ruled Shetland in its early days. As the event started, it was still light out, and the glow through the windows was beautiful. When I arrived at the event, there was a gauntlet of Vikings at the door. So every winter, there's an event called Appelia, where different squads of people dress up according to different themes, and they travel around and visit schools and old folks' homes and community centers and such. The biggest, coolest group is a group of Vikings called the Jarl Squad, and at the end of the night, everyone who was in any of the squads is given a torch, and they burn a Viking ship in the middle of a park, and it looks super cool. And then they go party for the rest of the night. Well, the Jarl Squad sent a group to the MRI Mackers event, and they were there at the entry to start. So, of course, I started giggling like an idiot as I walked through them. Their costumes were especially cool this year. It couldn't be helped. Later in the evening, they made their way up to the event and did some photos with people. And yeah, on my Instagram account, there is a photo of me with the Vikings looking ridiculous. The Mackers put on a really tasty meal of roasted mutton stew and bannocks and tables of baked goods. The Mackers were all there, and I got to get around and talk to some of them about why they help out with the fundraising and delve a bit deeper into their personal histories with knitting. After a bit, there was a massive raffle. People had been very generous with prize donations. I have to say, I did not win Billy O'Middletoon, the burrow bear made from Harriet's hats, but a better woman won. She was a Canadian woman who accepted him, did the photo op, and then turned and gave him back to the MRI Mackers for them to use for additional promotion of the cause. I heard this, and I think my heart grew 3 sizes. She is clearly the best person to win Billy, and already they've been putting him to good use. He has an account on Instagram, actually. It's at Billy_O_middle_tune. So just Billy O'Middletoon with the underscores between. And you can follow him there to see what he's been up to. Friday, I was able to go to the event at Bigton Hall. Again, there was a lovely dinner as part of the event, and then they showed a movie that had been shot in the 30s about living as a crofter on Shetland. There was a lot about knitting in the film, but just seeing their life in general was fascinating and made me so grateful for things like washing machines and running water. Finally, on Saturday, there was the awarding of the Flock Book Prizes for the year. That happened at Tingwall Hall, which was another local community center. And again, there was food, so much food. This night also had music and dancing. And honestly, we had been so busy all week that we were just worn out. So after we'd eaten and talked with some friends for a bit, we peeled out and went home to go to bed. And that takes me to my big tip for this episode when it comes to Wool Week. Don't overbook yourself. You'll hear in the next episode that my days were just as busy as my nights, and by the end of the week, I was crying uncle. And really, there's no need to load up on all the classes and do all the events because there are so many other things going on around the islands that I really regret not allowing myself more free time to be in the hub, talking to people, and just wandering around town and going to some of the other community hall events. So if you think you might be interested in Wool Week in the coming years, that's my tip. Leave yourself time to breathe. I hope this episode has given you an idea of the social experience of being part of Wool Week. Next week, I'll talk about the classes and share some things I learned. But let's have one more song before we wrap up. This is just a nice little song that sums up my feelings at the end of Wool Week, being with so many positive people, focused on so many positive things. This is Life is Wonderful by Zach Nelson.
If I had 1,000 tongues, I would sing with everyone. Voices like a mountain song. Sing, you are my only one. Oh my, oh my, oh my days. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life can be this good. I would launch 1,000 ships just to be about your lips, tell them all to sail away, just to see you every day. Oh my, oh my, oh my days. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Never understood that life can be this good. If I lived 1,000 lives, I spend them all with you beside. Never-ending deja vu. Never-ending days with you. Oh my, oh my, oh my days. Oh, life is wonderful. Oh, life is wonderful. Never understood how life can be this good. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Never understood. Life can be this good.
A few more things before I go. Morehouse Farm Merino is hosting the knit-along for, well, really any of the Harriet's collection patterns that are being sold to raise money for the Shetland MRI scanner appeal. The cast-on date for that is November 1st, 2019, so depending on when you're listening to this episode, hop on over to the Morehouse Merino Flock group on Facebook to join in with that. I'm going to be casting on for the fingerless gloves and the cowl, and I think I'm going to do them both in 2 colors instead of the 6 to match the 2-color version of the hat I knit out of the Morehouse for their knit-along. If you need the patterns, they're available at mrimackers.com for £4 each for the electronic version, or you can get a hard copy through the store at morehousefarm.com while her supplies last for $5 each. Just a heads up on how things look at the moment with release dates for upcoming episodes. As long as I still have interviews from my trip to release, I'm going to try my best to maintain a weekly release schedule, and it looks like that will take us through December. Coming up are episodes with Hazel Tyndall, Tanya Ashton-Jones, and Crystal Seyfarth, as well as a report on Loch Ness Knit Fest and the Fiber Festival of New England. But it's proving to be a little difficult to keep up the pace. Part of that is because I'm so freshly back from my trip and I'm having to play catch up. I think that things will settle down in a week or two, and hopefully I can keep going with the weekly releases. But if for some reason in the next month or two I miss a week, don't worry. It just means that the pace got to me and I needed to build some space into my schedule. I promise I will be back. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube as I Thought I Knew How. If it's a place that allows you to put spaces between words, then there are spaces between the words. Otherwise, it's all one word. The Facebook and Ravelry groups are both called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. I'm on Twitter as @ThoughtIKnewHow. The website for the show is ithoughtIKnewHow.familypodcasts.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode. Every now and then I post a blog post there too. Remember to please do your bit to support Fair Isle Knitting and Shetland Lace by donating to the Shetland Peri Mackers at crowdfunder.co.uk/Shetland Peri Mackers. Also, if you have time, if you could hop over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review, it really does help people to find the podcast, and I would really appreciate it. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.